Before I get to the transgender agenda, I want to have a little rant about identity politics. This is how it breaks down for me. I don't care if you're male or female. I don't care if you're black, white, Asian, Middle Eastern, Indigenous, or a combination of all those, and something else I haven't even mentioned or don't know exists. I don't care if you're gay, lesbian, bi, gender fluid. I don't care if you have a dick, wear a dress, and call yourself Caitlin. Just because you decide that you now want to identify as the opposite sex or not identify as anything at all. I don't give a shit. And no, it's not because I'm a bigot. It's not because I think you're less of a person. It's because most of the time, none of it matters. What's important to me is what you believe and why. I'm interested in your ideas, whether you're an informed, engaged individual that applies reason and logic to reach evidence-based conclusions. Invoking emotions and feelings as though they constitute arguments is for infants. Be objective and open, and that way you'll be better prepared to address real issues. Like the refugee crisis. How about the stifling of free speech by social media giants? What's your opinion on Brexit? Are you for the hump or shillery? What do you think is more important, equality of opportunity or equality of outcome? And to today's topic, what does the science have to contribute to the transgender debate? I want to try and move past the discussion around who can piss where and with whom, because I think that's less important than what the science says about this topic. My main source here is a statement from the American College of Pediatricians put out in April this year titled, "Gender Ideology Harms Children." Quote, "The American College of Pediatricians urges educators and legislators to reject all policies that condition children to accept as normal a life of chemical and surgical impersonation of the opposite sex. Facts, not ideology, determine reality." Now, that's my kind of statement. They go on to outline 8 points, which, don't worry, I'm not going to read them all verbatim because you can do that yourself. The link is below. But rather, note that these aren't just 8 bold assertions. They're all footnoted, and the footnotes are references to scientific studies and other scientific literature. So let's go through them and try to draw out the relevant pieces. Point 1. Quote, "Human sexuality is an objective, biological binary trait. XY and XX are genetic markers of health, not genetic markers of a disorder." Now, of course, there are extremely rare disorders of sexual development such as adrenal hyperplasia, and they are recognized as deviations from the sexual binary norm. Quote, "Individuals with disorders of sexual development do not constitute a third sex." Relatively straightforward, or you would think so. Point 2, quote, "No one is born with a gender. Everyone is born with a biological sex. Gender, an awareness and sense of oneself as male or female, is a sociological and psychological concept, not an objective biological one." And they go on to say, quote, "People who identify as feeling like the opposite sex or somewhere in between do not comprise a third sex. They remain biological men or biological women." End quote. Again, this should not be remotely controversial. In the footnotes is a link to an article entitled, "Is Transsexuality Biologically Determined?" So this addresses the argument that transsexuals, and you've probably heard the same argument about homosexuals, is that they were born this way. So how can you test this idea that you were born this way? Well, it turns out quite easily. You can study the sexual orientation of identical twins, because identical twins have identical genes. So if one twin is homosexual and you believe that homosexuality is genetic, then the other should be as well. But when you examine the evidence, only 11% of co-twins are homosexual. So you have to conclude your genes don't make you homosexual. Now, what about transsexuals? Well, transsexuals are much rarer, so there's not much data. But the data there is found that in 4 sets of identical twins, of which one was transsexual, the other twin was transsexual in only 1 case. So researchers concluded that genetic factors were most unlikely to be important because, again, quote, if genes compelled transsexuality, all the co-twins would have been identical. Genes may produce a tendency, but not a tyranny. And what about other arguments, often made by transsexuals and homosexuals, that they have a more feminine brain structure, and thus this brain structure leads to more feminine behavior? Well, the problem with that theory is that it runs counter to the evidence. That is, they have the causality backwards. It's not the brain structure that causes the behavior. The evidence suggests that it's the long-continued behavior that causes the brain structure. For example, it turns out that London taxi drivers have an enlarged part of the brain dealing with navigation, and violinists a larger area dealing with movement of the fingers of the left hand. Quote, there is no evidence that people are born with brain microstructures unalterable ever after, but there is strong experimental evidence that experience changes that microstructure. Transsexual brain differences would be more likely the result of transsexual behavior than its cause. Point 3. Quote, a person's belief that he or she is something they are not is at best a sign of confused thinking. End quote. It's known as gender dysphoria, a recognized mental disorder in the most recent edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it's never been proven otherwise. Point 4. Quote, puberty is not a disease, and puberty-blocking hormones can be dangerous. Reversible or not, puberty-blocking hormones induce a state of disease, the absence of puberty, and inhibit growth and fertility in a previously biologically healthy child. End quote. And there's a footnote to a study called Endocrine Treatment of Transsexual Persons, an Endocrine Society Clinical Practice Guideline, in which it states, quote, because a diagnosis of transsexualism in a pre-pubertal child cannot be made with certainty, we do not recommend endocrine treatment of pre-pubertal children. Point 5. Quote, according to the DSM-5, as many as 98% of gender-confused boys and 88% of gender-confused girls eventually accept their biological sex after naturally passing through puberty. So the key phrase here is as many as, because the actual range given in the DSM for boys is 70 to 98%, and for girls it's 50 to 88%. So even if you took the midpoint of those ranges, you end up with a number that suggests 3/4 to 80% of all kids that experience gender dysphoria eventually accept their biological sex after naturally passing through puberty. Point 6. Quote, children who use puberty blockers to impersonate the opposite sex will require cross-sex hormones in late adolescence. Cross-sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are associated with dangerous health risks, including, but not limited to, high blood pressure, blood clots, stroke, and cancer. End quote. And there are various footnotes to studies that report on those health risks. One in particular I've linked below. Point 7. Quote, rates of suicide are 20 times greater among adults who use cross-sex hormones and undergo sex reassignment surgery, even in Sweden, which is among the most LGBTQ affirming countries. End quote. This refers to a longitudinal study done in Sweden called the Long-Term Follow-up of Transsexual Persons Undergoing Sex Reassignment Surgery, cohort study in Sweden. Again, linked below. And here are some key quotes from that study. Mortality from suicide was strikingly high among sex-reassigned persons. In line with this, sex-reassigned persons were at increased risk for suicide attempts. And inpatient care for psychiatric disorders was significantly more common among sex-reassigned persons than among matched controls, both before and after sex reassignment. And finally, notably, however, in this study, the increased risk for psychiatric hospitalization persisted even after adjusting for psychiatric hospitalization prior to sex reassignment. Bottom line, you're just as likely to commit suicide, be depressed, or require psychiatric treatment before or after sex reassignment surgery. Point 8. Quote, conditioning children into believing that a lifetime of chemical and surgical impersonation of the opposite sex is normal and healthful is child abuse. Endorsing gender discordance as normal via public education and legal policies will confuse children and parents, leading more children to present to gender clinics where they'll be given puberty-blocking drugs. This is particularly important in the Australian context in light of the so-called Safe Schools program, which attempts to sell itself as an anti-bullying program, but in reality is at least in part about indoctrinating kids into embracing being transgender and intersex as normal. And if you want to know more about that particular situation, I recommend you watch Gary Awesome's excellent video titled Psycho Ward, in honour of the neo-Marxist author of the Safe Schools program, Ros Ward, and that's linked below. The statement finishes with the following section titled The Bottom Line, which essentially recapitulates the foregoing 8 points. I thoroughly recommend you read the statement in its entirety. That way, when the emotional infants start in about the need to protect the children or some other such crap, you can counter their ideological fear-mongering with facts and evidence informed by the science.